There are moments in this war that do not look like turning points when they happen. They arrive quietly, without the drama of a missile strike or a frontline breakthrough, without the visible footage of burning infrastructure or collapsing spans. They arrive as the absence of something, a signal going dark, a transmission that simply stops, a border that, from one day to the next, becomes slightly less useful to the country that has been using it as a weapon. On June 22, 2026, something like that happened on the Ukraine-Belarus border. For signal relay stations in the Gomel and Brest regions of Belarus, equipment that had been mounted on communication towers and used to guide Russian Shahd and German drones toward Ukrainian civilian targets went silent, not because they were destroyed, not because Ukraine struck them. They went silent because Alexander Lukashenko, the man who has ruled Belarus since 1994, who has allowed his country to become a launching pad for Russian aggression, who has hosted Russian nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil, who allowed Russian columns to drive toward Kyiv across his territory in February 2022, blinked. Stay with me, because by the time we are done here, you are going to understand not just what happened on June 22nd, but the entire strategic architecture of the confrontation that produced it, the ultimatum that Zelensky issued on June 19th, the week of silence from Minsk that followed, the intelligence picture that told Ukrainian commanders the stations had gone dark before the deadline even expired, and what all of this reveals about the most important and most misunderstood relationship in the entire northern dimension of this war. What Belarus actually is in this conflict, what Lukashenko's position actually looks like from the inside, and what it means for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the entire logic of escalation and deterrence that has governed this conflict since February 2022, that a 7-day ultimatum from a country fighting for its survival just produced a visible, documented, operational result from a country that officially claims it is not in the war at all. Let us start at the beginning of this specific confrontation, because the context matters and because the June 19th ultimatum did not arrive without history. On June 19, 2026, standing beside Honduran President Nasrius Fura at a joint press conference in Kyiv, Volodymyr Zelensky issued the most direct, most operationally specific public ultimatum Ukraine has ever directed at Belarus since the full-scale invasion began. He stated that on communication towers into Belarusian oblasts bordering Ukraine, the Gomel region and the Brest region, there were signal relay stations, both Russian and Belarusian, being used to actively guide Russian drone strikes against Ukrainian civilian targets. He named the specific Ukrainian oblasts being attacked through this relay chain, Zhytomyr, Rivne, and Volyn regions, as well as Ukrainian energy infrastructure more broadly. He said the equipment was not passive infrastructure. It was active targeting assistance. It was the mechanism by which Russian drones maintained the guidance signal they needed to find and strike Ukrainian civilians at ranges that would otherwise have been beyond reliable operational coverage. And then he delivered his ultimatum in terms that were precise, public, and final. He said 1 week would be enough time for Lukashenko to switch the equipment off. He said for words that should be heard clearly, if he does not, we will. The deadline, he said, expired on June 26, 2026 today, but the stations went dark. 4 days early, on June 22nd, 3 days after Zelensky spoke publicly and before the deadline he had said even arrived, Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky and Ukrainian military intelligence reported to the president that the relay stations had ceased operating on Belarusian territory. Zelensky announced this publicly. On June 24th, the fact is, he said, that as of today the equipment is no longer operating. What these relay stations actually were and why they mattered to understand why the shutdown of 4 signal relay stations in Belarus is more than a footnote in the daily war reporting. You need to understand what these systems actually do and what their operation meant for the Ukrainian civilians on the other side of the border. Russia's Shahd and German attack drone fleet, the Iranian-designed, Russian-manufactured kamikaze drones that have become the most numerically significant component of Russia's aerial campaign against Ukraine, are not autonomous. They require continuous data link connectivity during flight to maintain accurate navigation and targeting. At the ranges Russia is launching them from, that connectivity faces real physical limitations. Radio signals attenuate over distance. Terrain and the curvature of the earth create coverage gaps. Electronic warfare interference from Ukrainian air defense networks further degrades signal reliability to extend the effective range and Targeting precision of its drone campaign, Russia developed a relay chain architecture signal repeaters positioned at elevated locations along the flight path, mounted on communication towers or terrain features that hand off the signal from one station to the next, maintaining the drone's guidance link throughout its flight toward its target. Belarus provided an extraordinarily valuable geometry for this relay chain. The Gomel and Brest regions, positioned along the Belarus-Ukraine border, offered coverage over the northern approach corridors into Ukraine, the same corridors that Russian armored columns used in the opening weeks of the full-scale invasion to drive toward. Kyiv, a relay chain extending from Russian territory through Belarusian communications towers and across the border into Ukrainian airspace, gave Russian drone operators the ability to maintain guidance over Kyiv, Chernihiv, Zhytomyr, and the western Ukrainian regions at ranges and with a reliability that would not have been achievable through Russian territory alone. Ukraine's State Border Guard Service confirmed the operational signature of this relay chain directly. On June 24th, spokesperson Andriy Demchenko stated that Ukrainian border guards had recorded a drop in the number of Russian attack drones entering northern Chernihiv Oblast since June 22nd, and that large Shah drone raids along the Belarus-Ukraine border had ceased. The correlation between the relay station shutdown and the reduction in northern corridor drone activity was immediate and measurable. This is what Zelensky meant when he said the equipment was not passive infrastructure. Every night those relay stations were operating, they were helping Russian drones find apartment buildings in Zhytomyr. They were helping Russian drones locate energy infrastructure in Rivne. They were helping Russian drones navigate toward civilian targets in Volyn. The shutdown of those stations is not a symbolic achievement. It is a concrete, documented, operationally verified reduction in Russia's ability to kill Ukrainian civilians along a specific attack corridor, and it was achieved not by a Ukrainian strike on Belarusian territory, not by a covert operation, not by a diplomatic process that took months of quiet negotiation. It was achieved by a public ultimatum with a deadline. The silence from Minsk what Lukashenko did not say. One of the most revealing dimensions of this entire episode is what did not happen in the days between Zelensky's June 19th ultimatum and the June 22nd shutdown of the relay stations. Lukashenko said nothing publicly about the ultimatum, nothing about the relay stations, nothing about Zelensky's specific accusations. He did not deny the existence of the stations. He did not challenge the technical description of what they were doing. He did not issue a counter-threat. He did not call Zelensky's claims fabricated. He simply left Minsk on what was described as an extended foreign trip and maintained a public silence that, in the context of what was happening, spoke volumes. Compare this to the Kremlin's response. Russian presidential spokesperson Dmitry Peskov condemned Zelensky's ultimatum as absolutely aggressive interference in Belarus's internal affairs, violating Belarusian sovereignty. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused Zelensky of intimidating Belarus and called the Ukrainian president a Führer. The Kremlin also announced that Putin and Lukashenko planned to meet in the near future to discuss Zelensky's warning to Minsk, a statement that itself reveals something important. Russia felt the need to publicly signal that it was managing the situation, that Lukashenko was coordinating with Moscow, that Belarus's response to Ukraine's ultimatum was a matter being handled at the highest level of the Russian-Belarusian alliance. That is not the language of confident partners who believe the ultimatum is irrelevant. That is the language of partners managing a problem. Lukashenko's silence in the face of Moscow's loud protests is itself a form of communication. A man who publicly commented about the war, apologized to Zelensky in an Al Arabiya interview on June 16th for harsh personal remarks, and has consistently tried to maintain the fiction of Belarusian neutrality, chose not to publicly defend the relay stations when Zelensky named them specifically. He chose not to say they did not exist. He chose not to say Belarus was proud of them. He chose not to say Ukraine had no right to demand their removal. His silence allowed the stations to go dark and allowed the narrative to settle without a public confrontation that would have forced him to either explicitly defend Belarusian support for Russian targeting operations against Ukrainian civilians or explicitly defy Moscow by acknowledging compliance with a Ukrainian ultimatum. He chose the quiet middle path. He blinked, and he blinked quietly. Why this is the first time Ukraine's pressure has produced this kind of result. Appreciate fully why the shutdown of the Belarus relay stations matters beyond its immediate operational impact. You need to understand what Ukraine has been attempting with Belarus for the past year and why previous attempts produced nothing. This was not the first time Zelensky had raised the relay station issue. In February 2026, he stated publicly that the Ukrainian side had done everything possible to ensure that 3 or 4 stations no longer existed on Belarusian territory. No verification followed that statement, no operational confirmation. The stations continued operating. Ukraine imposed sanctions on Lukashenko in February 2026 in part specifically over Belarus's deployment of the relay station system in the second half of 2025. The sanctions did not produce a shutdown. Ukraine's opposition-led government in exile, the United Transitional Cabinet, had been warning Ukraine's foreign ministry as recently as June 21 that Lukashenko may be preparing to join Russia's war more directly, citing constitutional changes, rapid military expansion, and deeper integration with Moscow's arms industry. The entire arc of Ukrainian pressure on Belarus through February, March, April, May, and into June had produced statements but not operational results until June 22. What changed? The answer is the combination of public specificity, credible threat, and deadline. Previous Ukrainian statements about Belarusian relay infrastructure were either vague about the technical details or framed in terms that allowed denial and ambiguity. Zelensky's June 19 ultimatum named the regions, named the equipment, named the attack corridors, named the deadline, named the consequence. There was no room for Lukashenko to claim ignorance of what was being asked or pretend the demand was imprecise. And critically, Ukraine's credibility for following through on specific threats against infrastructure in and around occupied territories had been demonstrated. Repeatedly across the preceding weeks, the systematic destruction of Crimean railway bridges, the repeated strikes on the Moscow oil refinery, the documented shutdown of Russian air defense systems throughout the peninsula. The Zelensky who issued the June 19 ultimatum was not the Zelensky of 2022 asking a neighbor to please stop hosting Russian troops. He was the Zelensky of June 2026 who had just sent drones to Siberia and put Moscow's oil refinery offline for at least 6 months. What Lukashenko's position actually looks like from the incidito understand why Lukashenko blinked. You need to understand the trap he is caught in, because his position is genuinely one of the most constrained in this entire conflict, and most Western analysis dramatically underestimates the pressure he is operating under. Lukashenko is dependent on Putin for his political survival in a way that goes beyond normal alliance politics. The fraudulent 2020 election that sparked massive pro-democracy protests across Belarus came close to ending his rule. Putin's political, economic, and security support in the months that followed is widely assessed to have been the decisive factor in Lukashenko's survival. Russia has since deployed its Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile system to Belarusian territory, nuclear-capable weapons stationed in a country that shares borders with 3 NATO members, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, and sits 90 kilometers from Kyiv. Belarus has conducted joint nuclear drills with Russian forces. The Union State Agreement between Moscow and Minsk codifies shared military doctrine, joint exercises, and an explicit mutual defense clause that states an attack on Belarus is treated as an attack on Russia. Lukashenko is not just an ally of Russia, he is, in critical respects, a dependent of Russia, and his regime's survival is bound to the continuation of that relationship. And yet, within that dependency, Lukashenko has consistently tried to maintain at least a performance of Belarusian neutrality because he needs that performance for his own domestic political positioning and for the international legitimacy that keeps Belarus functional as a state. He has not committed Belarusian regular military forces to combat in Ukraine. He offered to mediate. He apologized to Zelensky. He told Al Arabiya that Belarus poses no military threat to Ukraine. He does not want Belarusian soldiers dying in Ukrainian trenches. He does not want Ukrainian missiles falling on Belarusian cities, and he does not want to be the man who turned Belarus into a co-belligerent in a war that Russia is losing more than 1,300 soldiers a day fighting. The relay stations sat exactly in the gray zone between those two pressures. They were operationally valuable to Russia. Moscow needed them and presumably asked Belarus to host them. But they were also the kind of technical infrastructure that could be quietly disabled without the public theater of a military confrontation, without Belarus formally acknowledging what the stations were, without Lukashenko having to stand in front of a camera and say he was complying with a Ukrainian ultimatum. The stations went dark on June 22. Lukashenko said nothing. Russia protested loudly and then planned a bilateral meeting to manage the optics, and the drones stopped coming through the northern corridor at the volume they had been. What Zelensky said next and why the story is not over. Zelensky was careful in how he announced the shutdown, and his carefulness is itself revealing. He did not declare victory. He did not praise Lukashenko. He did not frame the station shutdown as proof that Belarus had chosen Ukraine over Russia. He said the fact is that the equipment is no longer operating. He said he does not yet know whether the stations have been physically dismantled or only turned off. He said he is monitoring the situation closely and receiving daily reports. And then he went further, in directions that make clear the relay station episode is not the end of Ukraine's pressure on Belarus, but a chapter in an ongoing campaign. Ukrainian intelligence simultaneously announced the detection of new construction of military infrastructure in Belarus near the Ukrainian border, a development Zelensky disclosed publicly on the same day he announced the relay station shutdown. Ukraine has identified more than 3,000 Belarusian enterprises supplying Russia, with machinery, equipment, and components classified as critically important to Russia's war effort. Zelensky has already threatened Belarus's oil refinery sector, naming specific facilities whose continued operation in support of Russia's war machine places them on Ukraine's target list. The relay stations were, in Zelensky's own framing, Step 1. A concrete, verifiable first demand met with a concrete, verifiable result. The Belarusian enterprises supporting Russian military production are Step 2 waiting. There is also a harder question lurking behind the apparent success of the June 22 shutdown, and it is a question that Ukraine's intelligence apparatus is clearly asking: were the stations physically dismantled or simply switched off? A station that has been switched off can be switched back on. A station that has been dismantled cannot be reinstated in a day. Ukraine's public statement that it does not yet know the answer to this question is not an intelligence failure. It is a transparent signal to Lukashenko that the monitoring continues, that the verification process is ongoing, and that a reactivation of the relay network will be detected and will produce a response that Ukraine has already made clear it is willing to execute. The woman in Zhytomyr. What the signal going dark meant at ground level. There is a woman in Zhytomyr Oblast who has been sleeping in her basement since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Zhytomyr is one of the 3 Ukrainian regions that Zelensky specifically named as targets of the Belarus relay chain. It is a region that has endured drone attacks that traveled through the northern corridor guided by signals from Belarusian towers. This woman knows the pattern of the attacks, which nights are quiet, which nights the sirens come, which directions the drones tend to approach from. She does not know the technical details of relay station architecture. She does not follow signal intelligence reporting. She knows that on some nights the drones find her city and on some nights they do not. Since June 22, Ukraine's border guards have recorded a measurable reduction in drone activity along the northern Chernihiv corridor. Large SHOD raids along the Belarus-Ukraine border have ceased. The northern approach corridor is quieter than it was before June 22. Whether that quiet lasts, whether the stations remain dark, whether Lukashenko holds this position under Russian pressure, none of those questions are resolved. But for the night since June 22, something that was helping Russian drones find cities in Zhytomyr, Rivne, and Volyn has not been working. For the woman in the basement, for the families in the affected oblasts, for the air defense crews who have been intercepting drone after drone along that northern corridor, that silence is not nothing. It is the operational consequence of a 7-day ultimatum that the entire world expected to end in either a Ukrainian strike or a diplomatic standoff. It ended instead with Belarus blinking quietly without acknowledgement, without Lukashenko appearing on camera, without Moscow managing to prevent it, with 4 stations going dark on the morning of June 22 and a Ukrainian president announcing 4 days later, with the careful precision of a man who has learned exactly how much certainty the intelligence picture warrants. The fact is that as of today, the equipment is no longer operating. Nobody saw this coming, and that is exactly why it matters more than it looks.